the focus is not on establishing trust when you are going into this contracting, and it is going to spoil the culture and the motivation.
Now, if you're a really big company, I'm not saying you would never have multiple products, but many companies will internally pretend that they have, 50 different products. And the truth is they have one or two or three. Now, the first rule is don't do multiple teams. If you can have a single small team, that's better. And in fact, one great team probably runs circles around three mediocre teams. Now you end up with a telephone game, so there's tremendous distortion between what was actually wanted. What's delivered is not necessarily what actually serves the business need, because the more layers you have, but it's not factory work. This is research and design. This is work deep into the complex systems domain, where we're kind of feeling our way through the fog. And the truth is,
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. And today we have James Carpenter joining us to discuss about large scale Scrum framework, the LeSS framework. James, please welcome to the podcast.
thank you, Pradeep. It's a pleasure to be here.
James is the founder of Agile Carpentry, which is an institute invested in coaching around LeSS framework and many other agile related coachings. And also, James has written a case study which I'm holding in my hand, which was the primary reason I got in touch with him. It's a thrilling case study about how James applied large scale Scrum framework to kind of on a company which was into hardware and lots of big teams, and how kind of he observed the movement, the velocity, and he has described in great detail like how LeSS framework works, the complications around it, and around the relationships. James, please welcome to the podcast.
Thank
And
you.
today, let's discuss about your case study also.
Yes, sir. Happy to do so.
So, James, to start with, first question that I wanted to ask is, can you give a very brief overview of LeSS framework to the audience? Like what exactly is it and how is it different? And then we will dive deeper.
So Les is focused on creating an organizational design that is conducive to having an adaptive organ.
Okay.
So it goes far beyond process flow mechanics. It gets into how organizational structure drives culture and directly addresses those structural issues to a greater extent than any other canonized approach that I'm aware of. I believe the information in less in some ways is not new.
Okay.
Maybe perhaps some of it is, but much of it is not. But I'm not aware of any other canonization that covers the aspects that less covers to the extent that it does.
So, James, the first question that I wanted to ask is, less emphasizes on creation of feature teams, right, rather than component teams. And can you let us know what exactly is the difference between a feature team and component team, and why that differentiation matters?
Okay, so there's some confusion here in terminology. So a feature team in less parlance, which is has roots in an older definition of a feature team, is a cross-functional, cross-component team. So this is to say it is cross-functional in that the teams have various skill sets. You might have UX expertise and software engineering expertise and test engineering expertise and whatever other types of design expertise are needed to address the problem. And that it also is cross component in the sense that if your software architecture or whatever might be a hardware architecture has a complex topology with multiple layers, it is cross component in the sense that the team is working across those, such that the focus is on end to end, the ability to write an end to end vertical slice that goes all the way to address the end customer need.
Okay.
So the traditional Scrum definition in that sense, a component team would be a team that typically only has the skill sets to work on one component, or maybe two components. You get the idea.
Interesting. So what you're saying is, like, if in a company, in an organization, there are multiple departments and let's say multiple products, so to say, but a feature team is not going to be bounded by a certain product or certain kind of component boundary. If the need be and their feature demands, they should kind of go across those boundaries and take ownership of that feature and kind of start making changes in all those departments or components, and they have to own the feature from end to end and not just be limited by any particular abstraction or let's say isolation.
That's conceptually correct.
Okay.
Your usage of the word product,
Hmm.
the less is very specific as to spends a lot of time and energy on defining a product,
Hmm.
and a product is seen from an end-to-end customer delivery perspective, right? So,
Okay.
for example, let's say you had a checking system that a bank wanted to create, automated checking. Well, that might involve a cell phone. It might involve a mobile aspect. It might involve a web aspect. It might involve back-end systems that are tracking those finances and
Hmm.
doing whatever. It might involve being able to print physical checks. You
Right.
know, all of that aspect. And you would ideally define your product boundary sufficiently broadly to encompass all of that. Now, when we get into my case study, you'll see that the work that I was doing there was mostly an extended component team. So it was a compromised product boundary, which isn't a good thing, but it
Okay.
was, you do the best you can within the art of the possible is the
Okay.
challenge, right?
Okay. So, but we shouldn't be scared of crossing components, is what I understand. And the team should become comfortable kind of crossing those component boundaries and kind of working across multiple components, which are required for a feature in theory, in conceptually. Okay.
Yeah, I would
And
almost say you're set up to succeed or fail before you write your first line of code.
interesting.
How the team is structured and its what the boundaries on the team are
Sure.
has
And
tremendous influence on how successful it is in the long term.
another concept that has been mentioned often is like contract game. What exactly would you say is a contract game, and how should we deal with it?
So, contract game is the idea that the the engineers are put because fundamentally we know that this work is not that predictable, and so you end up in this common situation where the engineering staff, frequently in a waterfall context, frequently pretty senior engineering staff, is trying to commit to as little as possible with as long of a time horizon as possible,
Okay.
while at the same time the business is trying to get as much functionality as possible packed in tight, right,
Right.
with
Right.
as short of a time frame as possible. And at some perspective, it becomes an issue of ability to blame the other person as well as possible, right?
Okay. That's quite
So,
interesting. Okay.
this is described as by Bosvold and Craig Larman, who are the inventors of LeSS, as the contract game.
Okay.
Uh, you will see the same idea show up in Eli Goldratt phrased, a paraphrase of Eli Goldratt, treating estimates as commitments is in conflict with the desire of the engineer to be seen as reliable. Treating estimates as commitments is in conflict with the desire of the individual knowledge worker, desire to be seen as a reliable person. And that's for complex work. And if you treat estimates as commitments for this type of work, you'll destroy trust and
Okay.
transparency because you're holding someone accountable for something they don't control. That will in turn destroy quality
Okay.
because now there's not time, there's not quite time to do the job right. And
Hmm.
then thirdly, it will destroy forecast accuracy because everyone is having to pad their estimates and you end up with a cumulative probability distribution that's way out of whack.
Okay.
So what's interesting is trying to treat estimates as commitments for
Okay.
this type of work destroys your ability to forecast accurately, which was the
Okay.
very reason that you did it in the first place.
So what essentially is happening is like everyone is trying to play this game where they want to extract the maximum. So the management tries to extract the maximum work out of engineers. Engineers want a pace which is kind of sustainable, or they want to kind of don't want to overcommit, and so they want a larger buffer time. And in this game, everyone is trying to kind of what is happening is both of them are going to lose because if they undercommit,
You must lose.
then requirements will not come, and if they overcommit, and then again kind of expectation mismatch will happen. And in a way, it's also saying that contract game essentially is what I'm understanding is like instead of worrying about a feature, you are more interested into your contract, like what have I committed, what have I not committed, and you get too lost into that rather than kind of being passionate about the work that you're doing. Okay.
Yes, and the way you normally experience this is a death march towards the end of the project, right?
Okay. Right.
I'm sure most engineers who have spent any time, in the trenches
Right.
have experienced this, unrealistic schedule pressure that has
Sure.
nothing to do with actually delivering real customer value.
Right. Right. Basically, you hit a glass ceiling because there is nothing more you can do after that, and you will end up exhausted. You will end up losing motivation. Okay,
The problem is the natural variability of the work. So
okay,
you have work that could the common cause variation is reportedly around 400%.
okay,
So this work could take you 4 times longer than you thought. It could take you a quarter of the time that you thought. You really don't know. In fact, you don't really know until you're done, right?
okay,
You don't know
right,
when that monster is going to come out from under the bed. If
sure,
this were a room of engineers, I would ask, who here has, gone into some work and discovered that what the API said that it did isn't what it actually did?
right,
Or who has discovered that as you go to solve the problem, you find that what you thought the business requirement was isn't what it really was? Um,
right.
and
Which
there's
is
just
not
all
consistent.
kinds of problems, right? I
Right,
mean,
right, right. Basically, what we're saying is the focus is not on establishing trust when you are going into this contract game, and it is going to spoil the culture and the motivation, and both the parties will end up kind of just blaming each other in the end, which has no
yes,
value. Okay, okay, interesting.
you're trying to hold
Uh,
people accountable for things they do not control.
right,
And
right,
of
right.
course, pathological behaviors come out of that.
Also, a concept that has been mentioned often in your case studies about whole product focus. Okay, what exactly does that mean, and how can it be realized?
So again, you're looking at, you want to look at it from outside the walls of the company. What is your product offering? What is your company offering to the end user?
Right.
And how do and ideally your product boundary is representative of that thing being offered.
Okay.
Now, if you're a really big company, I'm not saying you would never have multiple products, but
Mm-hmm.
many companies will internally pretend that they have, 50 different products, and the truth is they have one or two or three. I had a client that was in the insurance space, and I remember my sponsor there who I think a lot of. He was like, there's only three products in this whole company.
Okay.
Uh, and
Okay.
I think he was right.
So you're saying that whole product focus is essentially implying that instead of focusing on your parts of the product, you focus on the entire product. And generally, there will not be many products in the company because though there may be kind of features spread across, you may end up calling those features as products, but essentially the underlying product is going to be just one or two.
In fact, there's a guide in the third less book, the
Mm-hmm.
one with the the green and the black edge, the more recent Addison Wesley, and it talks about there's a define your product guide, and it
Mm-hmm.
has these clarifying questions that are intended to help expand the product boundary as broadly as possible and look
Mm-hmm.
at it from a customer perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
then once you've done that, to sort of limit it to within what's practical. For example, if there are often aspects of the market you're serving that are served outside of your company's boundaries, and you may have very limited ability to influence the aspects that occur outside of your company. So you would intentionally define your product boundary to be smaller, whereas
Okay.
from the ideal product boundary might actually go outside of the bounds of your company.
Interesting. So you're saying that when you say product boundary, it's not just limited to let's say software or those parts, but how it is used, how it is distributed, how outsiders view it, right? The perception that's all part of your product, and so the boundary actually may be larger than what you actually perceive it.
Yes, and again, those are some nice clarifying questions of, there's some expanding questions and then some restraining questions.
Right.
And those are an interesting, you go through them and it helps you think about these things. Uh, you also could just come up to the average customer and say, what is it that you buy from this company? And they will say, hey, the reason we go to them is because of, you know, this is what we're buying. Just as that checking example,
Mm-hmm.
when you go into a big bank and you create a checking account, you didn't explicitly say, "Well, I'm buying a mobile app, or I'm buying a web app, or I'm buying,"
Right. Right.
you're buying the overall service.
Right.
And
Okay.
I will say this: less is focused on product development organizations. It
Okay.
is not designed for mass production of goods.
Okay.
That's a different type of work.
Okay.
It is not designed for,
Services and
more
all.
more
Okay.
predictable work, right? It is
Okay.
it is what a better word might be research and development environments, which includes most software engineering and
Mm-hmm.
firmware, hardware. Oftentimes there's a complex hardware firmware component, but it's not like I mean, that is the realm of less is focused on product development organizations. It assumes that the appropriate system optimization goal, so the explicit system optimization goal in less is to design an organization that is able to learn very effectively and be very adaptive. And
Okay.
how do you build an organization that is explicitly designed for value discovery and adaptability in delivering
Right.
value?
Hmm.
And if your optimization goal is something else, for example, let's say I'm building cast iron skillets. I'm
Okay.
not really looking to discover what a cast iron skillet should look like. I'm just trying, how do I make these cast iron skillets as cheaply as possible with,
Right.
perhaps short SLAs and all this other, how would I minimize inventory? You're looking in the realm of the lean space, or you're in the complicated systems domain, not the
Right.
complex systems domain.
Basically, where there is a lot of research involved, there is a lot of optimization, there is process, and eventually there is a single product around which many people are putting effort. Then less comes into play more strongly, because where you are doing repeatable work, less may not be required. But when you are doing something where the energy of the team is going into creating one product, or as you mentioned, one or two products, there less can play a very critical role. Okay.
And it's based around a Scrum nomenclature. But the important part is the ideas in less. They're true no matter what your nomenclature. So, you
Okay.
need words in order to articulate the concepts. And so
Right.
it helps to have names and so much so that as time has gone on, the Scrum Guide, the official Scrum Guide has
Hmm.
continued to change a bit and not always for the better.
Okay.
And it reached such a crisis that eventually the less company decided to release their own Scrum Guide. So it's an adaptation of the official Scrum Guide, and I would say that in many ways it's a return to the original intent of Scrum.
So basically, the original ideas, right, like agility and interaction over processing and all this in document, instead of excessive documentation, you do real delivery. All those things are going to be realized more deeply with less, because it doesn't care too much about processes and all those kind of unnecessary bureaucracy. It focuses on the meat of the work. Okay.
Yeah, you're looking at a much flatter organization. So you'll
Right.
find that a typical less related structure that's running in less. There won't be a PMO organization. There won't be you won't have a separate test organization. There just be the teams, right? You'll find that you will have a product owner or head of product or whatever you want to call that role, but they're playing
Hmm.
the chief of providing high level mission intent.
Okay.
But as to the elaboration on exactly the nuanced details of how do we solve this most important problem from a high level business perspective, so much of that is done by the teams directly interacting with the users and customers. So
Right.
a lot of this inception work
Hmm.
is being done by the teams.
Okay.
So you're not having like, oh, it flows through product who writes these detailed requirements. Even that work is being done by these self-managing, fully empowered teams. So this is, again, this is not any different than say 20 years ago when we started talking about, XP teams and early Scrum teams
Hmm.
before the Agile Industrial Complex distorted the original intent. What you do have with less is Boss and Craig had opportunity to apply this in some very large context, and they learned through experiment, through trial and error, which approaches worked better in order to actually go to multiple teams. Now, the first
Right.
rule is don't do multiple teams. If you can have a single small team,
Hmm.
that's better. And in
Okay.
fact, one great team can probably run circles around three mediocre teams. But at
Okay.
some point, you reach a scale where that doesn't work.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so we have the benefit of if you have to scale, how do you scale and how do you scale effectively? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't devolve into these deep organizational hierarchies that then destroy your ability to be adaptive?
You all have also mentioned in that case study that less demands that you have one single backlog instead of multiple backlogs, and one single product owner who supervises all the feature teams. So, what's the significance of that? If you can kind of elaborate on that.
So We want to ensure that we're working on the most important thing.
Okay.
And how do we know that unless we have a single consolidated list of things that we're going to work on? And
Okay.
this might be a Kanban system, it might be a Scrum based system. The point is, unless we force, unless we put our priorities into a forced ranked list, we don't and then we go through the politics of negotiating what really is the most important. Because what
Right.
often happens is you have a whole bunch of different opinions as to what should and shouldn't be the most important, and
Mm.
no one goes through the deals with the conflict to actually figure out what is the most important.
Right.
And the consequence is that you have a lot of teams working on stuff that in the big picture is not that important.
Yes. Okay.
So that's one aspect.
Okay.
It's also important to realize that these things that are in the list, these are not technical tasks. They should always be connecting to in business value in a meaningful way. Like what you want to do is bring the business problem to the teams and allow the teams to solve the business problem, not
Mm.
bring some technical, possible solution to the team and have the team implement that thing. Instead, you want
Okay.
to bring the business problem to the team and you want to work to address that business problem. And another related aspect is if you were to, there are some scaling approaches that take the approach of every team has their own little product backlog, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then you have a chief product owner or head product owner or whatever title
Mm.
that is then working with the other individual product owners per team to farm out the work
Right.
and distill it to the point that the teams actually, by the time the teams get it, they're just, they're just a what you'll hear called a feature factory. They're just chewing through the work,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're
Right. Right.
frequently not features in the way that we described of
Mm.
in true business meaning to the end
Right.
customer. So if you do what Les is suggesting, and Nexus does the same thing, for example, where you have a single consolidated backlog, one human would not be able to do the necessary refinement of the
Mm.
various product backlog items all by themselves if you only have the one. And the way that Les achieves this, the way that I would assume Nexus does the same, is that the teams are doing that lifting. So that
Okay.
work is offloaded to the teams, and the teams are doing that refinement. And
Mm-hmm.
this will scale up to 8, 9, 10 teams. You'll see the guidance that's given in less is that you should maintain that in less huge is that you should maintain a single requirement area up to around 8 teams.
Okay.
So if you're a small enough organization that you only have 8 or less teams, you don't need less huge. You have a single consolidated product backlog. It's nice and simple.
Right.
If you get to the point that you have 100 teams, what you find is that eventually the cognitive overload for the that product owner it
Mm.
does reach too much, even when the teams are doing the much of the lifting, even
Mm.
that becomes too much, and you do have to introduce a bit of a layered topology where you have an
Mm.
area product owner with an area
Right.
product backlog, and you have
Mm.
the high level product, and then you have
Mm.
the overall product backlog with a overall product owner, which is just called a product owner in less. But that's a compromise. That's a necessary evil only
Okay.
because you've reached a point where that one person just can't do it.
Okay.
Um, but you're still leaning heavily towards the teams doing that refinement. And if you're lucky, if the product space isn't too complex, if the teams are more mature, you can push that number beyond 8, right? You might be able to get to 10 or 12, but at some point, the experience tells us at some point you do have to you do have to move to less huge, and that can
After a
scale
certain
to
point of
thousands of teams.
right. So what you're saying is if your team sizes are small, let's say you have 5 or 6 small teams, a single product owner is ideal because he can kind of easily prioritize the items like what's the most important thing that the team should work. But if you grow up to a size where you have, let's say 30, 40 teams, then it's simply not possible for one guy to kind of oversee all the product backlogs. And this is where less huge comes into play. This is a very weird name in a way, less huge kind of,
I
as
didn't name it.
complicated as it may sound, but what less huge implies is like you divide your product into requirement areas, right? And for each requirement area, you have one product owner and kind of who should oversee the product backlog for one requirement area, because that's a necessary evil. One person cannot take the cognitive overload of, let's have 20, 30 teams. Okay. And
And even
that's
that division is done from a product centric focus, right? You want
okay.
to look at
Right.
this, you don't want this slice to be, oh, they're going to take that back end platform topology and the other one's going to
Mm-hmm.
take the
Right.
front end. You would always look to do the requirement area from a perspective of how can we slice the product in
Mm-hmm.
such a way that each requirement area is still serving a end to end customer
Mm-hmm.
need in a way, right?
I would like to go back to one of your previous answers actually, where you
Sure.
mentioned that the feature teams should be working directly with customers also, right? And they should be interacting with users. And I'm not sure, because what happens is that many times engineers are way too shy of kind of interacting with customers, and they feel like they will end up overcommitting, they will not understand the language, and there is a resistance in engineers to directly deal with customers, right? So what are we saying here, that in the feature team there should be some customer facing people also, or the engineers themselves should kind of face the customers?
Okay. So the way that people become good at interacting with customers is through experience of
Right.
interacting with customers, right?
Right.
So I also think a lot of the reasons that engineers historically are that some aspects that some portion of the engineering population is reluctant to interact directly is because they know that this contract game is going on in their legacy organizations and that it's very easy to become the scapegoat for something. And so
Right.
some of what this is just self-protection because it's not actually safe
Right.
to to do that. So that's
Right.
that angle is happening.
Mm.
But it's also fair to say that if you have a small group that is distilling down the requirements
Mm.
and then articulating them in a way that the engineers can understand them,
Mm.
then one of the advantages of this is you only have to have a smaller group that's doing that work.
Mm.
Now you end up with a telephone game, so there's tremendous distortion between what was actually wanted and what's delivered is not necessarily what actually serves the business need because the
Right.
more layers you have between between the people doing the work and the
Mm.
people using the product, the more distortion you're going to have.
Mm.
But it is a challenge. How do you get 60 people to all come to a common understanding of what the customer need is?
Mm.
And this is where multi-team refinement comes into play.
Okay.
So LeSS makes use of a variety of large group facilitation techniques
Mm.
to have the users and customers in the room as the various team members across all of the teams
Mm.
collaboratively refine what's in what needs to be in the upper part of the product backlog. So you're
Okay.
not worried as much about stuff farther down the backlog. You're mostly worried about
Mm.
under the product backlog. You're mostly worried about things that are in the one sprint horizon, the two sprint horizon. That's
Mm.
what you need to really get well tuned. And one example of this is one of many techniques is your product owner might say, okay, we're going to refine these five product backlog items that are currently at the top of the product backlog but have not yet been refined,
Mm.
and maybe give a very brief explanation of each one, maybe not that detailed at all,
Mm.
and then stick them around the room of a big gymnasium. Or you could do this digitally in
Mm.
Miro if in a digital canvas if you had to. Wouldn't be as
Mm.
good, but it could work. And then you would take the people from various teams and you would mingle them. So you might have a software engineer from the first team who's with a group that has a test engineer from another team and a UX engineer from another team. So you've intentionally mingled the teams, right?
Mm.
And then
Okay.
you've clustered them into little groups, and you've broken them up into, in this example, five groups,
Mm.
and you
Okay.
have put each of them around the room, standing at where one of those sticky notes with that story was, right? Or
Mm.
that PBI,
Okay.
right? And then maybe you set a timer and you say, okay, for 10 minutes, discuss that and try to refine it and make sure they have whiteboards and other materials there at that
Mm.
station.
Okay.
And perhaps you have the user that knows the most about that is standing next to that as well, right?
Right.
They have a discussion, timer goes, then you rotate, and every group clicks over. Now, maybe that user, that subject matter expert might stay next to their card, right?
Mm-hmm.
The
Right.
entire group rotates, and you would do this for 6 clicks, right?
Okay. Okay.
And after you've done, 6 rotations, the group that first saw that first card
Mm.
on the sixth rotation, they'll come full circle and they'll see how it's evolved, right?
Right. Right. Okay.
And so that's an example of review roulette. I think it's a no, it's not. Anyway, that's a roulette technique, whatever you call the thing.
Okay.
And you'll see that if you were to now get to a sprint planning session and you ask the question, which engineer or which team member, let me be more precise, might not be an engineer, which team member understands this item on the product backlog? Or which
Okay.
team members? Which ones have
Okay.
been exposed to it?
Hmm.
And clearly the answer is everyone on every single team of these 8 teams has been exposed
Right.
to this PBI. Now, and not only that, they have frequently been the ones who flushed out the acceptance criteria, and they really understand it. And they will need to decide which of the teams is going to actually go implement it. And
Okay.
that's something that happens in sprint planning part one,
Okay.
which is usually pretty brief. And then sprint planning part two looks a lot like a standard Scrum sprint planning where they're tasking things out. The An interesting criticism of this would be, aren't you taking a tremendous amount of time of
Hmm.
these expensive, you know, team members
Hmm.
to do this refinement? Wouldn't it be better to have someone boil down these requirements and then just pass them on along?
Hmm.
And if this were less complex work, that might well be true.
Hmm.
If this were factory work, that might be true.
Right.
But it's not factory work. This is research and design. This is work deep into the
Hmm.
complex systems domain
Right.
where we're kind of feeling our way through the fog.
Hmm.
And the truth is that the risk of building the wrong thing is far greater
Okay.
than the time investment that it takes to make sure that there's an understanding there. Because what we're trying to do is bring the business problem to the teams and allow the teams to solve that business problem in whatever creative way makes the most sense to make the company more money and more successful, and et cetera, right?
True.
So, and I would also argue that people tend to discount the fact that now you have all these middle management layers that are
Hmm.
there just to do nothing but distill things down,
Hmm.
right? Now, I'm not saying that you don't have product expertise,
Hmm.
but that product expertise tends to be on the teams. You may have people that are traditionally trained as product managers who might be, or UX, who might be on the team rather than in a dedicated siloed specialist team of some sort. They're on the team. So you have to, think of team as a more inclusive than this is
Hmm.
someone with their heads down on the keyboard writing code. That's not the way to think about a Scrum team or a less team as well, because it's the same thing.
Okay.
In large measure, Scrum is less, or less is
Okay.
Scrum. In large measure, less is Scrum. I wouldn't say the other's true, but in large
Okay.
measure, less is Scrum, and then it
Okay.
builds on it. Well, how do you scale it?
I think what I'm sensing is like less gives a lot of importance to, let's say, wisdom of crowds, or what you say, you know, different people think differently, right? And when you all of them are
Yes.
exposed and to a problem, very very creative solutions can come, similar to the manner, let's, for example, we were saying in the beginning, right, that if engineers are directly exposed to the customers, and all that whisper game is gone, right, because somebody would pass the information to somebody and then somebody, A to B to C to D. In the end, what the requirement which engineer gets may be completely different than what the customer actually expects. That's one problem that we have solved by kind of directly putting engineers in front of customers. And the other thing is, like, as you mentioned, right, even when you are having very varied group and discussing the problem, again, since there are variety of people kind of discussing about that problem, it can ignite a lot of creative, energies, and you may look at things very very differently with a lot of different perspectives, and people can warm up to the problem, right, rather than just one guy being warmed up and giving the, like a list of items to dos that you do this and this problem will be solved. Everybody warms up to the problem, and then there is a more creative and, let's say, passionate contribution to solving that problem in a way. Okay, very, very interesting this
I
aspect.
agree. You know, something comes up here, a common question is, well, do you expect every team in LeSS to be able to work on any subsystem within the whole product,
Mm.
right?
Hmm. Right.
And if you only have two or three teams, the answer is probably yes, right?
Hmm.
That's eventually what happens because you're
Right.
an environment here that's very supportive of multi-learning, of people
Right.
cross-training each other in all kinds of dynamic ways.
Hmm.
Um, but let's say you had eight teams, and let's go back to that checking example only because that's something people can typically understand.
Hmm.
Now, a lot of your change, let's assume that many of the changes that tend to show up on the product backlog
Hmm.
have to do with making changes within the mobile app. And once in a blue moon, there's something that requires making a minor change in how the physical checks are printed, right?
Right. Right.
It's likely that most teams would, over time, because this was what kept coming up on the product backlog, that's towards the top, they'd probably all develop some level of expertise in changing the mobile app, right? There
Right.
might be
Right.
one or two teams that have more expertise in doing that than others.
Hmm.
And if it was a really gnarly problem, perhaps the teams would decide that that team should take the problem. And then maybe a team that had less experience would say, hey, can you look for one that's a little easier and we'll take that because we need to become better at that ability
Right.
to work on the mobile app, right? But
Right.
over time, because there's so much mobile app changes happening, most teams would probably be familiar with changing the mobile app.
Right.
But in this example, I said, the checking is almost the printing of the physical checks is almost
Right.
very seldom changed. And let's say it's some big clunky old system, and there may only be one or two teams that have the people on them that have expertise in making those changes.
Hmm.
And unless the teams collectively decide there's a business risk here because our bus factor is too low, right? We
Hmm.
get too many,
Right.
people get hit by a bus and we're in trouble. Um, Other than that, mitigating that risk, it may well be the case for a long time that there's only one or two teams that have deep expertise in changing that checking stuff because we don't need more capacity on it. It's relatively low value.
Hmm.
We just kind of leave it. But
Right.
let's say that the backlog starts to change. And all of a sudden, we have some new functionality about putting a picture of your dog on your check and all kinds of new stuff that we didn't historically do.
Hmm.
Then the teams in their uh, may start to decide, you know what, we need to cross train more teams in working on this system, and that would change. Now, what's interesting about this is that the two key points that I'm thinking of. First is this addresses that, oh, do you mean that every team knows how to do everything even at scale? And the answer is no. There's going to be natural affinities. But that doesn't
Hmm.
mean they don't all have the authority and the abilities to go change it. It just means that there's going to be natural affinities as to where certain knowledge is.
Right.
But the second interesting observation is that when the composition of the product backlog changes,
Hmm.
the teams naturally, organically will evolve in what they work on. Even if the teams themselves stay very stable, that knowledge will evolve based on what the most important things are. And
Okay.
it doesn't require management to come in and do an organizational restructuring
Right.
because the composition of the product backlog changed. So you
Right.
have an organization that is designed to organically adapt without forceful management imposition
Okay.
to changes in the needs.
Very interesting. What, so what we're saying essentially is, like, since we have not constrained the teams to work on one single component, they are warm. They have been warmed up to work on different areas also. Maybe be not be the core contributors there, but depending upon the needs of their future, they have went and touched many aspects of that, the product. They don't have this resistance of fear to kind of, or let's say the organization doesn't have to worry way too much when a requirement comes where, you know, where there is, let's say, core area of the product and only two people have the knowledge. That situation we are avoiding here, and tribal knowledge, we don't kind of appreciate here because everybody is going to touch every system and they will have some knowledge at least. And for whatever reason, let's say if we end up in a situation where there is a tribal knowledge and those people leave the company, that knowledge will also go away. All those kind of things are being taken care of here because everybody has some idea about everything. Uh, at least the areas where their product needs have came and they have worked at least. Okay.
But they also have awareness
Right.
because we have that single force ranked product backlog
Right. Right.
or input list or whatever words you want to use, because the
Mm-hmm.
idea is what's important,
Okay.
not the word so much.
Right.
Um, they're aware of it. So I'm
Right.
sure that, I mean, I know I suspect you have. You've been on teams where every team had their own backlog, right?
Right. Right.
And you probably had the ability to go look at what another team's product backlog was,
Right.
right?
Right.
Their
Right.
individual team's backlog was.
Right.
But in practice, did you ever have time to actually go take a look?
I mean, people, if there is no need, they wouldn't bother.
They wouldn't bother.
You
They're just too busy
right.
with other stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the problem is that everyone's having these blinders in these legacy
Right.
organizations,
Right.
and they don't have the awareness. So not only do we have this freedom and ability and the
Mm.
safety to for the teams to self-manage and to go learn whatever they need to learn,
Mm.
we have an organizational design and a flow control design
Right.
that is conducive to them being aware that there's an issue in the first place. And that would and also to naturally focus on whatever the most important things are and to focus their learning on the most important thing, because it may well be that you have a team that's wonderful at working on some esoteric thing,
Mm.
but it turns out that, let's say that every PBI they're working on is only worth $5 per day in revenue, but
Right.
what
Right.
some other team is working on is worth $5,000 per day in additional revenue, right?
Right. Right.
But and this team here is like, hey, look, we're getting our stuff done, and and in their little world, they just don't realize that each of their things that's making $5 of additional revenue per day anytime they implement that new functionality
Right.
is
Right.
just, in the big scheme of things, not nearly as important as these bigger, higher value items that they don't
Right.
even see. So we
Right.
give awareness, because how can you self manage
Right.
as a team member if you do not have awareness of this? And
That is
this
a
is
very good
traditionally,
point.
of course, managed by your product management. In the traditional model, you've got product management that's making those decisions. But in to
Right.
do so, you're introducing the telephone game.
Mm.
What's built is less likely to be what's needed, and
Mm.
it tends to be a lower trust environment.
So we're
And
not just
perhaps if you had
in
all offshore developers
right.
that were done by a
We're
staffing
not just
company, you might
yeah.
run differently. You might not have that freedom.
In a way, we are saying we're not just destroying this silo behavior, but we are also making people aware of what is really, really important, and that awareness will automatically lead to organizational topology where people get self-manage themselves into a manner where they know that this thing is important. This is the essence of the work that they are doing. More focus has to be there, and kind of wastage of resources will be reduced because you will stop prioritizing things which are not adding value automatically. Okay.
It's also much more rewarding
Mm.
individually. You get to work on stuff that you know is important. You
Right.
probably have a relationship as a team member. You probably have a relationship with the people you're serving. I mean, you have, on, let's say, biweekly, tri-weekly, whenever you have these multi-team refinements and other,
Right.
and as well as sprint reviews, you're interacting with these customers, right? You're
Right.
seeing the whole problem, and you
Right.
go home and you say to your spouse, "Hey, you know what we did today? It's like made the difference. We moved the needle. This thing we did, I'm
Right.
excited about it." Instead
Right.
of, "Oh yeah, I'm moving some bits and I don't quite know why I'm doing it, but I'm told to do it, so I'm going to do the stupid ticket and just keep them off my
Right.
back." So
Right.
emotionally, it's more rewarding as well for people.
Okay.
It gives them a sense of purpose that is
Right.
lost
Okay.
otherwise.
You know, on the same lines, another question that I have is: so in an organization, there is a sales team, there is marketing, there is a customer success teams these days, right? Who account managers, and so does less have any perspective on these areas also, or is it more focused on engineering? Like, because eventually, if you want to have revenue, you want to align all the way from engineering to sales to marketing, everything, right? So, what does less say about alignment of an entire organization rather than let's say just engineering?
So where's the end of your product definition?
Right.
That's
Okay.
the real question. And I think that's going to be very context specific. If you're building very bespoke products, that boundary is going to stretch pretty broad or
Hmm.
pretty vertical, I would say, right? Up through the sales layers and everything, right?
Right.
If you're building an off the shelf, packaged product, if you're building an iPhone or a MacBook or this kind of thing, right? To a
Hmm.
mass market customer base, or as in covered my case study, a blade infrastructure that's sold to millions of customers that are,
Hmm.
they may be paying million, they may be writing multi-million dollar checks for the product,
Right.
but
Hmm.
there's still a bunch of them, right? That's going to change that dynamic, right? And to what extent is, yeah, so that's going to change your boundary. The thing that Les is good at is, where is a system optimization goal of the ability to support rapid learning and
Okay.
to rapidly adapt? Where is that system optimization goal appropriate to the organization? It tends to be very appropriate in the product development organization.
Okay.
The extent to which that system optimization goal is appropriate outside of that boundary is going to, outside of traditional R&D product
Hmm.
development, is going to be very context dependent. But I
Okay.
suppose that's a smarter question. Is the system optimization goal around which less is designed, is that still appropriate in the context of the question that you happen to be asking?
And so product definition and product boundary. I think these are some of the concepts that any person who is embarking on this less journey should be very aware about, right? Like when you say product boundary and product definition. And here we are not necessarily thinking in terms of just features of the product, right?
Yeah,
And
that's right.
more.
That's right.
So, what exactly the product definition and product boundary imply here? Like, if you have to write it on a wall so that everybody every day in the morning can see that, what would that be?
I think again, it's that guide that I can't remember off the top of my head. There's only like three or four expanding questions and three or four restraining questions, and it is whatever's in that guide in the third book. But it's basically, how do we serve the end customer, and is this product boundary defined in a way that is, an end-to-end vertical slice that is related to what people write, give us money to build.
Okay, interesting. And about feature teams, like, what would you say is a good size for an efficient feature team? Is there any magic number that you have in your mind?
Uh, Historical guidance. This is pre-AI Gen, okay,
Okay.
or Gen AI.
Yeah.
Historical guidance, I believe, it's like 6 to 8.
Okay. 6 to 8. Okay.
So so traditional Scrum is 3 to 8 developer
Okay.
people on the dev team, right? I believe
Mm-hmm.
that's right. Sometimes you'll see 3 to 9. And if you have a single team, that's true. And a small team can often do better than a bigger team. And there's some, as long as you have the skill sets to do the job, that's
Right.
the big question. Do you have people that are cross-functional enough to handle it? But what happens is, scaling, let me not use a cuss word here. Scaling is challenging.
Mm.
And the more teams you have to coordinate, the harder life is.
Okay.
Even if the teams are coordinating themselves, the more overhead there is in coordinating, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So if you're going to have multiple teams, in order to keep the coordination headache, in order to lessen the coordination headache,
Mm-hmm.
empirical experience suggests that it's better to lean on the larger end of a standard Scrum team, because that way you have less teams to coordinate, right?
And is there any guidance like how should you divide the feature teams? Like, let's say you are working in a logistics, let's say freight related application, okay, where you are tracking the vehicles and delivering freight. So, would the features drive the feature team here, right? So, does that mean like every feature team should have one they should be revolving around one big feature, right? Essentially.
So first off, the teams are self-organizing, and the people decide what
Mm.
their team composition should be. They form
Right.
up in teams themselves, right?
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Um, I remember watching a documentary, and it was talking about how they train bomber teams in, the bombers that
Okay.
bombed the smithereens out of the poor Germans in World War II, right? So they would train the tail gunners, and they'd train the radio men, and they'd train the pilots and the co-pilots and the bombardier and blah blah blah, right? And everybody had expertise in their thing. And then they all put them in a big hangar, And I think they probably had something on the lapel that said, I'm a tail gunner. I'm trained as a this. I'm trained as a that. Right.
Okay.
And they were all put in a big hangar, and they were told, when you come out of this hangar, you need to
Mm-hmm.
be formed up into teams. And so they would pick their own
Okay.
teammates
Okay.
to go to war with. Right.
Okay.
This is very similar. Is that the teams have to come up. They are accountable for self-organizing into teams, but it is also true. But let me back up a bit. But within some constraints. So the constraints is that every team needs to be able to like do meaningful, useful work.
Okay.
And I would imagine in order to help do that, it would be good to have a definition of done to kind of
Okay.
guide that. It wouldn't have to be a perfect definition of done, but
Mm-hmm.
enough that when people were self-organizing into teams, when you did a flip
Okay.
event and they all basically did the equivalent of going in the hangar and figuring out what teams they're on, right?
Okay. Okay.
Um, that they kind of understood, hey, we need to make sure that every team that we put together meets this, has the ability to go end to end and do whatever this definition of done is requiring of us, right?
Okay. Okay.
Um, it might be helpful to have some idea of, they don't have to be well refined, but some idea of what's on the product backlog. Because I would imagine if you're saying, hey, you need to form into teams, and it's not so simple as I have a button on my lapel that says I'm a tail gunner, right? It's not.
Right.
It's
Right.
life isn't that simple in this case.
Right.
Um, the it is simple in that we don't have to go to war. That's good. But uh, so it would help to have, okay, what is our definition of done, even if we're going to refine it further here in in an hour later. What is
Okay.
our definition of done, or a draft definition of done? What is the draft of what we think we're going to be working on if we don't already intrinsically understand it? And in some contexts, they already do, right? And so it depends on context as to whether or not you need that. Um, and kind of have an idea of that, and then have the teams self-organize,
Okay.
and then you would also kind of pressure test them. So management might say, so I've heard people say things like, management will actually go and they'll kind of think through what team compositions might be, and on a board, and then hide it, like put a blanket on it or pull down a projector screen on top of it. Let the team self-organize
Okay.
and by themselves, and then ask, hey, is uh, are you really just going with your friends, or did you actually come up with teams that can actually do this? And think through this and kind of challenge it. And if
Okay.
they get completely stuck, you might say, well, here's what I came up with, but it might not be a good choice. And maybe that this is even dangerous. This is, you're running the risk of disempowering the teams by the very thing I'm suggesting. So I would be very cautious with this idea, and I
Okay.
certainly wouldn't give it to them to start, right?
Okay.
Um, but you do need to kind of pressure test, are they just doing it with their friends? And it's not uncommon that they'll go the first round and they'll mess it up, and the
Okay.
second or third round, they'll get it right.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
it depends
Interesting.
on the maturity of the engineer of the team members. It depends on how experienced they are. It depends on probably lots of social politics of how clicky are they, and so you might end up with a great composition on the first pass. When I did it in the case study, um, we did it one afternoon. Everybody seemed happy. The next morning, people had been talking, and they moved one or two people around. Right?
Okay.
Not
Okay.
management did. The teams did it themselves. Like they went to bed. They slept about it. I suspect that the more senior engineers had some of the leads had conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reluctant to use the word leads because there isn't a lead in a less structure, but the more senior engineers
Okay.
had some conversations with each other, and they made some decisions to kind of, hey, maybe we should shift it a bit, and they did, but only like one or two. They had it mostly right the first pass, but that was
Okay.
only three teams, so that was the start, or three or four teams to start. It was a small to start, and then it grew.
Okay.
So
And on the same line, you've also mentioned that the team should be flat, right? Like when you say, but there will be people with differing levels of seniority and
sure.
specializations, right? So does less say that? these kind of titles shouldn't be given the front and kind of at least not be advertised way too much because it can have negative impact on the team. Is that what we're saying here?
I would agree, but compensation definitely has to account for that level of expertise, right?
Right.
So your more junior person is not going to be paid the same that your more senior person is paid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to bonus structures, or if you're a startup, maybe equity structures, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you want people to work together as a team
Mm-hmm.
or as a team of teams, as the case may be, they need to be economically compensated as a team or as teams, not as
Okay.
individuals. So you'll see a lot of Fortune 100s will do this forced ranking thing, and
Okay.
it's the comes from the GE world. This we're going to rank and yank, right? And the people that are in the top percentile of goodness, they get a disproportionately great bonus. They might get 40% of their take home pay as bonus, and someone else gets 10%, and someone else gets 0%, and
Right.
someone else gets laid off. I mean, if you do this kind of thing,
Mm.
you're going to absolutely destroy the interest of the incentives for people to work together as a team.
Right. Right.
So how your financials work, or how you not just how you budget your work
Mm.
and fund your teams, but even how do you pay the individuals within the team has a tremendous impact on what you can expect to get from the outcome. So it's important uh, uh, that you incentivize at a higher level, not at individual level in that regard. One of the things that's common is to say, well, we're hoping that everyone has boss is running is in Wartzilla. I can't say it right. And
Okay.
what's interesting now is he's like head of engineering there, at least for this one part of the group. It's not the whole thing, but for part of it. And uh, I think they may have compensation committees, and I'm going to mess this up, but it's something to the effect of, as you build up these different skill sets, the group decides that yes, you're worthy of this pay bump, right? And I think
Okay.
even some of that's been democratized to some extent, right?
Okay.
And so you're not so much competing with you're not gaining additional income by moving up the pecking order in the hierarchy,
Okay.
but rather by continuing to grow as a team member and broadening your skill sets and capabilities, which are beneficial to the company,
Okay.
and that you wish to measure your ability to do that independent of it's not about competing with your teammate. Ideally, everyone is able to continue to grow. Does that make sense? Um,
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, so what we're saying is like, every individual has his own personality and skills, but when your future team forms, the combination of those skills becomes a rather separate skill, different skill, right? Team skill. And we are rewarding the team skill for your capability to, let's say, be productive, your capacity to kind of help each other and kind of grow as a team, which is probably have going to be a compound effect rather than each individual trying to contribute, right? So the team's
well,
contribution will be way higher than what an individual's contribution is going to be if they work as a team in passion and
I think there's some truth to that, although it
mm,
wasn't exactly what I was trying to say. So
mm,
what I was trying to say is to the team that let's say that like if the product is a success and
mm,
makes the company money,
mm.
then the people who help build the product should be rewarded for that.
Correct,
And,
correct,
and
right,
that reward should be, you know, maybe it's X percentage of your salary or something. It's something that's seen as fair and not pulling people apart, right?
right, right, right,
That's
right,
that's one statement. And then another aspect is that uh, as an individual, let's say you're a software engineer,
mm,
but let's say you don't have experience with mobile,
mm,
but it would be useful to gain that experience. And
right,
maybe you also don't have experience with as much database work as you would like to, right?
mm,
As would be beneficial to the organization.
right,
And so the organization might say, as you become more competent in working on mobile and demonstrate expertise there, and as you become more competent in working in the database, then and demonstrate experience there, then we will be able to increase your pay, right?
Right, right,
And you have another teammate, and maybe they come from a testing background, but they have not done as much. They're not as skillful at refactoring code, and so much of the test code is code, right? You know, test code is production code, and they need to be gain. They need to gain in that skill set, and perhaps they're also interested in becoming better at design, right? At
right.
UX design, right?
Mm.
And so the team might be collectively self-aware of what each individual is trying to do,
Okay,
is trying to grow. They might. I've even seen that where it's plotted, like where people have these skill set charts,
okay.
and the team will actively help each teammate. So, for example, if I'm
Mm.
working on something and I know that Joe over there is looking to become better at databases, and I happen to be a DBA, which I'm a lousy DBA. But
Right.
let's say that I was. I would say, hey Joe, I'm going to be doing some database work. Would you like to pair with me on this task because I know that's aligned with where you're trying to expand. The same
Right.
might true for, Sally says, hey, Joe, I'm doing some mobile work and I know that you wanted to become better at mobile. Will you pair with me on this? And in
Sure.
the same way that, let's say that I'm lousy at UX design, someone who says, hey, James, I'm doing some UX stuff. And so the teams might collectively
Grow.
work to improve everyone's skill set, and there might be some value in externalizing that, but you also want to financially reward that effort,
Right, right,
which is much different than whoever's the best on the team is going to get 40%
right.
bonus and everybody else is going to get 10%, or that's a different thing, right?
Okay, right.
And the bottom guy's going to get fired. I mean, that's what we typically see in like big banks and stuff sometimes.
Right, right, right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. And yeah, I mean, that makes sense because, if each team member helps each other team members grow, right, eventually that would also be very helpful. And in a way, kind of you are not only growing yourself, but you're helping others also grow. And that would make it easier for, management to kind of be more generous with the financial increments and all. And very interesting. And there can also be some free riders in a team, right, who are not doing as much an effort to contribute to the success of the team. But I think that topic may not be relevant here. I believe if
That's a bit of a different topic. And then how do
uh,
you handle that? And there's
right,
different schools of thought. Um,
correct,
One school of thought is to let the blister grow until the
okay,
team ejects them, right? In other words,
okay,
you don't
okay,
you don't you don't inject yourself. You allow this is a scrum master, you know,
okay,
mentorship question, right? So
right,
how, as a scrum master or comparable role in a different structure, um,
right,
to what extent do you allow the team to work the issue out for themselves,
okay,
right?
okay. I
And
think freedom of the
yeah.
teams is very important, right? Like the teams have to learn to self manage. It's like they have to become mature, and you should not kind of mingle too much, or should I say, uh, try to drive the team as per some procedures and process rather than let them learn, adapt, and grow and take decisions also, even big decisions. Okay.
But if you have a young child
Mm.
who's learning to ride the tricycle, you might allow them to fall. You might say, hey, you have to wear a helmet, right?
Right, right,
So that, like, we're going to maybe some pads. So we're going to limit the impact. Or in the same sense, you
right,
say, you don't let them stick their finger in a light socket and kill
right,
themselves, right?
right,
So
right,
it's okay for them to get a little bit hurt, but not too
right,
hurt. And so
right,
there's
right.
there's there's a judgment call there of
Okay,
uh,
right.
pain
Understood.
that they learn from is good. Pain that kills them is bad.
Correct. True. James, I think it was a very fantastic discussion, and I'm sure the people who are watching this would have learned something about it. And the less framework, particularly, I believe it is still a bit uncommon because we hear a lot about safe and let's say TOGAF and all those things, but less. Uh, I am very excited about less, actually, frankly speaking, and from the last time I learned about it because it kind of believes in tackling the problem with the horns, right? You don't kind of shy away from taking the bigger challenges. There is a sense of confrontation, but at the same time, you develop maturity, right? That's where I think less is very different from all the other frameworks that I have experimented with, and it naturally and kind of truly scales the Scrum, right? So Scrum was very good, but when it comes to kind of align multiple Scrum teams, right, there was no direction, and with less coming in, uh, it has provided direction in that area also. And most of the companies, what I've seen is they, when they're very small teams, right, they do very good work, but when things start growing and teams start expanding, all the friction, all the, you know, thought related issues start coming, and less might be one of the best solutions out there, because instead of bringing more bureaucracy, it brings more clarity. And on that note, I would like all the audiences also to comment, like, have they tried less? Has it worked out for them? What are the questions that they would like to be answered? And James, any last words that you would like to advise before we wrap up?
I had a thought. So on my website, the agilecarpenter.com, in the
Okay,
nav menu, there's a learning link in the nav menu of my agilecarpenter.com website.
okay,
Um, the current LeSS website is wonderful in the sense that it has all of this great information in depth.
right,
But the downside is it's kind of like throwing an encyclopedia set at somebody.
right,
And if you know what page to look at to learn,
right,
that's
right,
great. But it doesn't do a good job of, well, you should read this first and this second and this
right.
third. And so what I've done on that learn page is I have most of what it does is it links into the content that's on the LeSS website. Not in all
Mm-hmm.
cases, or it links to this or that LeSS book. Um,
Right,
and it's not that uh, it is taking you to that encyclopedia in many
right,
cases, but it's saying, why don't you start with this article and then this article and then this article? And so if you're new to LeSS, it's a
right,
wonderful way to
right,
uh, get your feet wet. And once you've done enough of that, then you don't need it anymore. But especially early on, it also happens to have a link to my case study. Is in,
okay,
about midway down the page. It says, hey, and if you want to read my case study, and also links to the others that are again deep in the LeSS website. It
right,
gives a link to that. And then people have complained before that some people like to print out the case study and make notes on it, and they find that's useful, whichever case study. But it isn't always easy to print out the case study, and so
right,
you will find there are also printable PDFs in both letter and A4, I think it is the equivalent to whatever the A. I think it's A4. Um, and there's also links to Amazon and Barnes and Noble where you can just have them print it for you. So I
sure,
just uploaded it there so that they can print it cheaper than your home printer can print it,
right,
but not cheaper than the office printer that you don't have to pay for can print it.
right.
So, um, so there's that.
Okay,
So if you want to learn about LeSS, consider going to my website to the Learn link because it will help you know what to read first.
right.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
that would be awesome. I think I would advise all the guys to go to agilecarpentry.com. It's a great website. A lot of effort has been put there, which you will immediately notice to organize, because less can be a bit scary in the beginning, because there are lots of concepts, and if you directly go to the less website, you may end up spending a lot of hours processing that. But if somebody has written case studies, or somebody has given a step-by-step guidance, like, then you can easily kind of as James mentioned, you can make feet wet, and then you will not be kind of a. I would also suggest that go and read the case studies if possible, because their direct and more practical application of less has been detailed in, and you would be able to relate to those problems because they are all real case studies and where they have dealt with real world problems of productivity, team management, relationships, and uh, how people get kind of a when people leave, right, a certain company, for example, in their own case study, how other teams can be affected by it because somebody had great relationships and was very well meaning. And so I would also suggest go to read the case studies,
Yeah.
and of course go to
Which are
agilecarpentry.com.
also linked off that Learn page. By the way, I link
Right,
not only to my own, I link to the others, and
sure.
they're on the LeSS website. You just have to know where to find them.
Yeah, yeah. Save
Uh,
the effort, save yourself some effort.
uh,
Go to agilecarpentry.com, go and read these case studies. It would be definitely helpful. particularly if you're a growing organization, and so would we all would also read it, kind of try to imbibe as much as possible and see where it goes.
And feel
Thank you.
free to reach out if anyone, if feel free to reach out for me. I can do consulting or I can deliver a course pretty much globally if there's a
Okay,
need.
sure.
So it's just, but hopefully this has been helpful. So
What I would do is I will drop a link to a LinkedIn
sure.
connection, and people who are interested can directly reach out to him, or of course through the agilecarpentry.com also you can contact him. Get yourself a coach, always helpful, and you know make your life easy with less. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Same here.